November 14th, 2023. 6:47 a.m. local time. Temperature -11 Celsius. Vovchansk sector, northeastern Ukraine. Two men sat inside a modified Mitsubishi Delica, engine off, parked inside a collapsed roof grain store 3 kilometers behind the forward line of contact. Their equipment was simple: a Mavic 3T thermal quadcopter, a DJI-RC2 remote controller, a laptop running DJI thermal streaming software, a Motorola radio linked to an infantry rotation moving through the tree lines 4 kilometers north. Their call signs were Sparrow and Creek. Sparrow was 27. Creek was 31. They had been flying Overwatch for the same infantry company since early October. They knew this terrain by thermal signature, which copse of trees ran warm from decomposing leaf matter, which stretch of road held residual heat from armored vehicle exhaust, which irrigation ditch held standing water that would ice over just before dawn and drop its temperature signature below the surrounding soil. That morning, their job was straightforward. Watch the eastern approach, cover the rotation, log anything that moved. What happened in the next 11 seconds was not on any mission brief. At 6:47:23 a.m., Sparrow picked up 2 fast movers on the thermal feed. He almost dismissed them. Aircraft transited the sector regularly. Most were too high and too fast to track with a quadcopter sensor. These were different. Low. Extremely low. Hugging the tree line at what he later estimated was under 300 meters altitude. 2 aircraft, close formation, southwest to northeast track, approaching the broken industrial district of Vovchansk at a ground speed that put them in and out of sensor frame in seconds. The trailing aircraft vanished at 06:47:34. Not from the edge of the frame, not by climbing out of range. It disappeared in a white thermal bloom that saturated the sensor array for 1.3 seconds and then resolved into a debris field spreading east at low altitude. A wing section, fuel vapor, something that might have been a landing gear strut, rotating slowly against a gray winter sky. The lead aircraft did not turn back. It continued northeast, climbing slightly, and disappeared from the Mavic's operational range in under 40 seconds. Sparrow said nothing for almost a full minute. Creek was watching the same feed. Neither man had ever seen an aircraft die from the inside. Neither man would ever see one again and feel nothing watching the footage. This is the inside account of how 2 Ukrainian drone operators with a $4,500 quadcopter documented the loss of a $36 million Russian strike aircraft, and why the Russian Ministry of Defense still has not officially acknowledged that a second Su-34 ever flew that mission on November 14, 2023. The story begins 6 months earlier, in Vovchansk itself. Vovchansk is a small city in the Kharkiv oblast, sitting less than 2 kilometers from the Russian border. In May 2024, Russian forces launched a renewed ground assault across that border, pushing into the city in a concentrated effort to stretch Ukrainian defensive lines and force redeployments away from the Zaporizhzhia axis. The fighting was grinding, close, and brutal. Urban blocks changed hands multiple times in a single day. Buildings were reduced to rubble that then became fortified positions. Both sides depended heavily on air assets, Russian aerospace forces for strike support and battlefield shaping, Ukrainian drone units for reconnaissance, fire adjustment, and overwatch of ground movements. By November 2023, the situation had partially stabilized into a contact line running through the city's northern industrial districts. Ukrainian forces held the southern portions. Russian forces controlled the eastern outskirts and maintained supply corridors running back to the border through scattered woodland belts. Into this environment, the 3rd Aerial Reconnaissance Group, a unit whose full designation remained classified until a partial HUR intelligence release in May 2024, had deployed two-man Mavic teams to maintain persistent overwatch on the northern approach routes. Their mission was to watch, log, and report, not to strike, not to engage, to see. Sparrow and Creek had been assigned the eastern quadrant, the stretch of ground between Vovchansk's ruined brick factory district and the Vovcha River, covering a 3-kilometer arc of terrain that infantry rotations had to cross on the way to their forward positions. Their specific mission on November 14th was coverage for a company-size rotation. Approximately 120 Ukrainian soldiers moving in small groups through designated corridors, using pre-dawn darkness and thermal camouflage tarps to limit their signature from above. By 6:30 a.m., most of the rotation had cleared the open ground. The last platoon was 2 minutes from cover. Sparrow had the drone at 380 meters altitude, hovering in a slow drift pattern to reduce motor noise signature. The thermal imager was set to highlight mode, white hot, which rendered engine heat and human body temperature as bright against the cold ground. He was watching the tree line when the two aircraft appeared. The Russian Air Force had established a deconfliction protocol with its own ground-based air defense units in the Vovchansk sector. Altitudes below 500 meters on the eastern corridor were supposed to be flagged as manned aircraft approach routes in the integrated air defense network. The Pantsir-S2 battery positioned near the border crossing at Lushkivka, 11 kilometers northeast of Sparrow's position, had received that protocol document in written form 2 days earlier, on November 12th. It didn't matter, because the document was 6 days late. The Pantsir-S2 is a short to medium-range surface-to-air missile and anti-aircraft artillery system. The S2 variant, introduced in 2015, includes an upgraded thermal tracking system and IFF transponder interrogation capability. In theory, the system queries an approaching aircraft's transponder. If the aircraft responds with a valid Russian military identification code, it is marked as friendly and excluded from engagement solutions. The crew waits. The aircraft passes. IFF only functions when the aircraft's transponder is transmitting. Both Su-34s were flying in radio emission control mode. MCON, standard procedure for low-altitude strike approaches in contested airspace. The pilots had disabled their active radio emissions, including their IFF transponders, to avoid detection by Ukrainian air surveillance radar systems. The Su-34 was approaching fast and low and electronically silent, exactly as its crews had trained to do in precisely this threat environment. The Pantsir crew at Lushkivka queried both contacts, received no IFF response from either, elevated both to threat category based on approach profile, and engaged. The missile struck the trailing Su-34 at 6:47:34 a.m. What the Mavic feed captured was the missile's terminal phase from a range of approximately 840 meters, close enough for the thermal sensor to resolve individual heat sources, far enough that the full event was in frame. Sparrow had been recording continuously since 6:15 a.m. as standard mission protocol. The footage was intact from before the aircraft entered the sensor frame to the moment the debris cloud began dispersing east. Neither man knew what they had captured. Not yet. Sparrow began climbing the drone immediately to extend sensor range and assess the debris. Creek got on the radio to the infantry company. The explosion had been close enough to hear on the ground at that distance in the cold air, and the company commander was demanding a status report. Creek told him it was not ground ordnance. He wasn't certain what it was. Then came the intercept. A SIGINT team from the 83rd Separate Radio Technical Brigade, positioned in a monitoring station outside Kupiansk, 70 kilometers south, had been passively monitoring Russian aviation frequencies throughout the morning. Their equipment logged all traffic on designated frequency ranges without gaps. The intercept was captured at 6:48:15 a.m., 41 seconds after the explosion on the Mavic footage. The lead pilot, callsign Bars-21, transmitted a routine altitude report to his ground control element. His voice was level. No distress marker in the transmission format, no query about his wingman, no request for search and rescue. The transmission lasted 6 seconds. Altitude, heading, fuel state, routine, then silence. For the next 41 minutes, Bars-21 flew back toward his base in Russian airspace, made normal contact reports at standard intervals, and received a landing clearance. At no point in the recorded intercept, 43 minutes of continuous capture by the 83rd Brigade's collection system, did he ask where his wingman was? At no point did his ground controller ask either. I went through the partial intercept transcripts that HUR released in May 2024, and one detail kept pulling me back. The lead pilot's final transmission before landing was not a distress notification or a report of an unusual event. It was a fuel state readout, numbers only, delivered in the same flat procedural tone as every other transmission in the log. Whatever Bars-21 knew or didn't know about his wingman's fate, he had made a decision before that transmission. And the decision was silence. The Mavic footage was uploaded that same evening through secure channels. Sparrow connected the drone's storage card to the mission laptop and exported the thermal data through DJI's radiometric format, converting the raw sensor output to a standardized file with temperature overlay data preserved. The file was 2 minutes and 44 seconds long, starting from the moment the aircraft pair entered the sensor frame. At timestamp 06:47:31:12, 3 seconds before the missile detonation, the trailing aircraft's engine heat signature is clearly visible on the left side of frame. The Su-34 runs 2 Saturn AL-31FM 1 turbofan engines, producing approximately 122 kilonewtons of thrust each at full military power. At low altitude on a cold morning, those engines generate a thermal output that the Mavic 3T's 640 by 512 pixel uncooled long-wave infrared sensor renders as near white against the dark terrain background. At 6:47:34:08, a second thermal signature enters the frame from the northeast quadrant. Smaller, moving significantly faster than the aircraft. The sensor cannot fully resolve it against the aircraft's own engine bloom, but the geometry is consistent with a surface-launched missile in terminal engagement phase, a near-vertical intercept arriving from above and slightly aft of the aircraft's left engine nacelle. The detonation saturates the sensor for 1.3 seconds. When the bloom clears, the aircraft signature is absent from the frame. In its place, a dispersal cloud at approximately 250 meters altitude, expanding east at the prevailing wind speed of 12 to 14 kilometers per hour. The lead aircraft's signature remains visible in the upper right corner of frame throughout the entire sequence. Its course does not change. Its speed does not drop. It does not circle. Creek marked the GPS coordinates of the debris center of mass and logged the timestamp in the mission record. Sparrow drafted his incident report on an encrypted note application and transmitted it up the chain of command before they drove the Delica out of the grain store. By 10 a.m. local time, the footage and incident report were in the hands of a duty analyst at Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, the HUR, in Kyiv. The initial HUR analysis hit an immediate obstacle. The thermal footage was compelling but not independently conclusive. The missile's approach angle, the detonation timing, the debris trajectory, all of it was consistent with a surface-to-air intercept rather than mechanical failure or mid-air collision. But identifying the specific weapon system required cross-referencing the event against electronic order of battle data the Directorate maintained for Russian air defense positions throughout the Kharkiv sector. That database was current only to the previous week's update cycle. The Pantsir-S2 battery at Hlushkivka had been repositioned 6 days before the incident. The repositioning hadn't been captured in the database yet. The analysts were searching for a system in a location where the records said it wasn't. It took 11 days to resolve. On November 25, 2023, a senior analyst at HUR's Technical Intelligence Division completed a 34-page assessment cross-referencing the Mavic footage with signals intelligence, radar track data from a Ukrainian ground-based air surveillance station near Zolochiv, and satellite imagery from 2 commercial providers showing confirmed vehicle positions in the Hlushkivka area over the preceding 2 weeks. The satellite sequence showed a Pantsir-S2 combat element, 2 tracked vehicle platforms with characteristic radar and launcher profiles, arriving at the Hlushkivka position on November 8. That position placed the system's engagement envelope directly over the flight path, logged for the Su-34 pair. The finding was definitive. A Pantsir-S2 battery, designated in Russian logistics documents recovered in subsequent months as 4th Battery, 606th Air Defense Regiment, had fired a salvo of 2 missiles at 6:47:31 a.m. on November 14, 2023. 1 missile missed, 1 did not. The battery had been repositioned to Hlushkivka 6 days before the incident. The repositioning had not been reflected in the airspace deconfliction notice distributed to aviation units operating in the sector on that date. The Su-34 crews had flown their mission with a deconfliction document that described an air defense landscape that was already 6 days out of date. The Russian military had shot down its own aircraft because a positioning update moved 6 days slower than the battery it was supposed to describe. What's striking about this case is that it wasn't negligence in any fog of war improvised sense. It was a traceable, documented failure of a coordination system that the Russian aerospace forces and Russian ground forces have spent years and significant procurement budget building and refining. IFF transponder protocols, airspace deconfliction notices, unit positioning updates. These are not improvised safeguards. They are institutional procedures that exist specifically to prevent this outcome. The Pantsir crew followed their rules of engagement correctly given the information they had. The Su-34 crews executed their low-altitude approach profile correctly given their threat environment. Both crews did exactly what they were trained to do. One aircraft was destroyed because a transfer document moved 6 days slower than the unit it described. That's coordinated institutional failure from the inside, not sabotage, not individual incompetence. A system that works correctly and still produces a catastrophic outcome because the gap between reality and the paperwork describing it was 6 days wide. On the Russian side, the response to the incident was methodical concealment. A crew member's death in Russian military service triggers a formal inquiry under current military administrative law. That inquiry requires a named casualty, a documented cause of death, and a unit notation in the Central Casualties Registry. All 3 elements create a paper trail that propagates through multiple administrative systems: personnel records, pay records, next of kin notification, medical and survivor benefit applications. The Russian Ministry of Defense faced a specific problem. Acknowledging a friendly fire loss of an Su-34, an aircraft that costs approximately $36 million at acquisition price, with a total Russian fleet of approximately 130 airframes, in a war they were publicly describing as proceeding according to plan, would require explaining both the loss and its cause to a domestic audience that had been repeatedly told Russian air defense was protecting its own forces effectively. They found a simpler solution: According to Ukrainian intelligence analysis of Russian military administrative records captured in subsequent operations, the November 14th strike sortie from the Su-34's home base, believed to be Voronezh-Malshevo Air Base, approximately 300 kilometers northeast of Vovchansk, was logged in the official mission record as a single aircraft sortie. 1 aircraft, 1 crew. Mission type: close air support. Mission status: completed. Return to base. There is no record in the administrative documents Ukrainian intelligence has been able to access and authenticate of a second Su-34 departing that base for a Vovchansk sector mission on November 14, 2023. No tail number in the flight log. No crew manifest entry. No fuel allocation record for a second aircraft. They didn't say the Wingman crashed. They said the Wingman never flew. The honest assessment, which may draw some pushback, erasing the flight entirely, is the smarter cover-up compared to falsifying a crash report. A crash investigation generates residue across multiple systems: wreckage documentation, next of kin notifications, cause of death filed in the central registry, replacement aircraft requisition that references the loss. Each of those creates a point where the false narrative can be queried or cross-referenced by someone with access to adjacent records. Erasing the flight is cleaner. The pilot still exists on personnel paper. He still appears in the payroll system. His family may receive normal communications for months: a deployment notice, a reassignment flag, then a prolonged silence that military families in Russia have learned not to question publicly. The question of where he is doesn't become an administrative crisis. It becomes a classification problem. And classification is something the Russian military system handles with significant experience. The families of Russian servicemen who died in circumstances the military finds inconvenient have described receiving vague notifications, paper reassignments to units that don't operationally exist, and in documented cases, direct communication from command structures advising them not to discuss their family members' service publicly. The Wingman's name has not been confirmed in any open-source record. HUR has not released it in the declassified materials. What the HUR assessment does confirm is that physical debris consistent with an Su-34 airframe was identified in the coordinates that Creek logged on November 14th, and that satellite imagery from November 16th and 17th shows what analysts assessed as a Russian military recovery operation at that location, using 2 Ural 4320 transport trucks and a crane vehicle, operating in Russian-controlled territory where the debris had landed. They retrieved what they could. They removed the evidence from ground they controlled. And they filed it nowhere that anyone outside the system could access. What would you have done at 6:47 a.m. flying a $36 million aircraft at low altitude in contested airspace if your wingman simply disappeared from your formation with no radio call, no visible cause, no distress signal, just gone? Would you break radio silence? Would you risk giving your own position to Ukrainian air defense by transmitting? Or would you do what Bars 21 did, transmit routine fuel state, request a landing vector, and let whatever happened to your wingman become someone else's problem in a system that handles these things quietly? The answer probably depends on what Bars 21 knew in those first seconds. And what the Mavic footage can't tell us, what no available intelligence can resolve, is whether his silence was shock, discipline, or something he had been briefed to do in exactly this situation. The HUR-declassified assessment released on May 18, 2024, ran to 22 pages in its public version, roughly 2/3 of the full classified document. It included annotated still frames from the Mavic footage, transcript excerpts from the SIGINT intercept with timestamps, a schematic diagram showing the Pantsir-S2 battery position relative to the aircraft track, and the missile intercept geometry, and a technical appendix describing the methodology used to authenticate the thermal footage against known Su-34 infrared signatures. The response from Russian state media was a 400-word item in Rossiyskaya Gazeta on June 11, 2024, 3 weeks after the HUR release, describing Ukrainian drone proliferation as a minor tactical irritant with no strategic effect. Unnamed Ministry of Defense sources. No mention of the November 14th incident. No mention of friendly fire losses. By the date that article published, the Mavic footage had been viewed 11 million times across YouTube, Telegram channels, and international news aggregation platforms. The gap between those two realities, 11 million views versus 0 official acknowledgement, is not a failure of information control. It is a deliberate calculation that the cost of acknowledgement exceeds the cost of denial, even when denial is publicly implausible. Russian information management in this war has consistently operated on that calculation. The audience for the denial is not the international community. It is domestic. And domestically, the system still controls the authoritative record. There's a line in the HUR assessment that reads almost like a detail someone included by accident. In the technical appendix on sensor capabilities, the report notes that the Mavic 3T thermal imager used by the reconnaissance element, standard commercial configuration, no military modification, has a minimum resolvable temperature differential of 0.1 degrees Celsius at standard calibration. The Su-34's engine heat signature, captured at 840 meters range in -11 ambient air temperature, produced a differential the system rendered with complete sensor saturation. The aircraft was too hot not to see. The drone cost $4,500. The aircraft cost $36 million. The Pantsir-S2 missile system that fired the engagement rounds costs approximately $15 million per battery unit. The SIGINT collection system that captured Bars 21's transmissions represents years of investment in signals intelligence infrastructure. And the most complete forensic record of the entire event was recorded by a 895-gram quadcopter designed for agricultural surveying and search and rescue operations. Comment yes or no. Do you think the Pantsir crew at Hlushkivka ever found out what target their missile actually hit? What happened to Sparrow and Creek after the incident is not publicly confirmed in any unclassified document. The HUR assessment credits the footage to a 2-operator Mavic reconnaissance element from the 3rd Aerial Reconnaissance Group. No names, no photographs, no unit location. The group received a unit commendation citation in December 2023. The specific grounds for the citation were redacted in the version accessible to the public. The footage they captured on a $4,500 quadcopter on a cold November morning did something that no formal intelligence collection asset in that sector managed to accomplish on November 14, 2023. It created an unbroken evidentiary chain, GPS coordinates, continuous timestamp, thermal imaging, synchronized with SIGINT from a completely separate collection team 70 kilometers away that allowed analysts to reconstruct a friendly fire incident in forensic detail, months after the responsible state had restructured its administrative records to deny the incident occurred. The Su-34 Wingman's final seconds are on record. 1.3 seconds of thermal saturation at 6:47:34 a.m. A debris cloud expanding east at 12 kilometers per hour into territory that Russian forces controlled and immediately secured. The official mission paperwork says he never flew. The Mavic footage says otherwise. If you want the full breakdown of how HUR analysts cross-correlated the radar tracking data with commercial satellite imagery to confirm the Pantsir-S2 as the specific firing system, the technical methodology behind that identification process, That full analysis is in our next video. It changes the way you think about what commercial technology can now accomplish in battlefield intelligence collection. Subscribe if you haven't. Notifications on. We cover these declassified accounts as they come out of HUR and GUR analysis cycles, and they come out faster than most channels can track. The Wingman has no official grave, no official mission record, no official cause of death in any document the Russian state has released. In the Russian administrative system, he simply ceased to exist on November 14, 2023, in a sky that a $4,500 quadcopter happened to be watching from 840 meters away. Some things can't be erased once someone is already recording.